Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining us. I'm Becky Ellis, editor here at DSM, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar on supporting sow longevity, combating mycotoxin susceptibility in today's hyperprolific sows. So I'm here with three experts in sow health, but before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes for everyone. So first, to let you know, we have pre-recorded portions of the webinar to make sure we don't have any problems with connectivity during the presentations, but all of our speakers are here with us live and eager to answer your questions. So type your questions into the questions box on your screen, and we'll have a Q&A after the presentations. So all of your questions will get answered. If we run out of time to answer your questions here, we'll send you an answer via email. So with that, let's get things going. I'd like to introduce Bruno Silva to start us off. He received his PhD in swine bioclimatology and nutrition from the Universidade Federal de Viçosa, with apologies to our Portuguese-speaking colleagues. He is currently a professor and researcher in swine nutrition and production, animal bioclimatology, and monogastric nutrition at the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, or UFMG. He's also an associate editor of the International Scientific Journal Animal, an International Journal of Animal Bioscience, and reviewer of several international A1 journals. He develops research in the areas of nutritional requirements and environment of swine and tropical regions, and works in scientific research partnerships with several institutions in the field of swine nutrition in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Welcome, Bruno.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Becky, for the presentation. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today. I'd like to thank DSM for the invitation, and welcome all of you that are listening to us this afternoon in Europe, this morning in the Americas, and evening in Asia. What we'll be discussing in the next few minutes is understanding a bit the nutritional and the management factors that will impact directly on sows' longevity, understanding how genetics has changed our animals and what we need to understand and what we need to do from a nutritional and a management point of view if we want to reach maximum productivity in these animals. We know that from a genetic point of view, these animals have changed. So we have sows that produce much more piglets. We have sows that are capable of producing much more milk, and therefore are sows that are much more demanding in terms of environmental and sanitary conditions. For instance, if we look at the productivity or the potential of these animals, we'll see that there are several moments in the sow's life that the management and the environment can impact on its longevity and its future productivity. We'll be focusing today mainly on the gestation and the lactation phase, because that's where the animal goes through different anabolic and catabolic phenomena. But if we look at the nutritional demands, or at least what these animals are capable of producing, you'll see that, for instance, during gestation, for sows to produce on average 40 kilos of piglets per year and 63 kilos of conceptus weight per year, this is equivalent in terms of nutrients to approximately 36% of the sow's body mass per year. And when we focus on the lactation stage, which basically we are concerned mainly on milk production, we're talking of an equivalent of around 200% of the sow's body mass over the year to sustain 560 liters of milk production on average. Besides this high productivity from a growth perspective and from a body weight perspective, the sows have also changed, because genetically we've made these animals more efficient and we've made these animals more leaner. So this means that these sows have a higher metabolic weight, they have less fat, more protein, and from a genetic point of view, if we're selecting for more feed efficiency in the later grower stages, we're also selecting against feed intake for the sows. So what we see is that the sows, they continuously grow until 4th, 5th parity, but these animals have a completely different body structure, and these animals have a different feed intake capacity. So this means that they produce more and they eat less, meaning that there is a risk that we might go into a negative balance or severe negative balance, which will have consequences on this animal's longevity. We'll be discussing this in a couple of slides. We also have to consider that we have differences between parity orders. A young sow is completely different from an adult sow. While adult sows have a higher retention rate in terms of nitrogen retention in the first 50 days of gestation, because this is directly related to body weight recovery, young sows have a higher retention rate, nitrogen retention rate, after 50, 60 days, which is directly related to the growth, the natural growth or natural development. So they're preparing themselves for future stages. So it's highly relevant that we understand that these animals not only are producing much more piglets, not only are producing much more milk, but these animals continuously are growing. And also we have to understand that young sows have a completely different dynamic in terms of nutrient utilization, in terms of metabolism, when we compare them to older parities. So we cannot feed these animals in the same way. Genetics has also been selecting for more teats, and this is clear when we look at our modern genotypes. So for instance, in the year 2000, back in the year 2000, I used to select for 12, 14 teats. Nowadays, we're selecting for more than 16 teats. So 16, 17, 18, and even 20 teats, for example, if we look at the mammary gland apparatus of this little gilt here in the picture. If we consider that there is a dynamic change in terms of growth of these components, so fetal and mammary gland development, you'll see here that, for instance, mammary gland development after around day 80, that's where we get an exponential growth rate of the mammary gland. And also the same happens for the fetal development, where after 70 days, we also get an exponential growth rate of this fetus. We see that when we put these together, it means that the nutritional requirements of these animals, they do increase after on average 70 days of gestation. So this means that if we have more piglets and if we have a larger mammary gland apparatus, this means that we probably will have higher nutritional requirements needs. And this is what we can see, for example. So for instance, when we model the nutritional requirements for mammary gland and fetus development for a third parity sow, for example, so making a simulation here according to the number of teats and the number of fetuses. So for instance, if I go from 14 to 16 teats, this has an impact on average, so from day 70 to 114, an impact of around 14% extra in terms of lysine requirements per day for this animal. And we look at energy, it's around 16% increase in energy requirements for these animals during this period. If we go from 14 to 16 fetuses, so this means 2 extra piglets, it is also an impact of around 14% in terms of lysine requirements and 13% in terms of energy requirements. But if we look at our little gilt, for example, that has 20 teats, so she went from 14 to 20, we're talking about an impact on average of 42% extra lysine and energy over this third phase of gestation. And if we talk about hyperprolific sows, this is also very similar. We're also talking about an average of 43% of extra nutrients during this stage. So what we see here is that the animals are producing more. These animals have a much more dynamic growth rate. These animals are more demanding in terms of nutrients for body structure and for body development. And we have differences between the animal categories. It is also very interesting to understand that these requirements, they are also dynamic throughout gestation. It means that it's not static, although we tend to establish the requirements based on averages of specific moments. So for example, the first 50 days, and then from 50 to 84, and then from 84 to 115 days. But it is not static, it is dynamic, it changes on a daily basis, where we will see that at certain moments, one nutrient will be more important than the other. For example, during the last phase of gestation, amino acids or protein in general is much more important than energy for these animals. So this means that the ratio between amino acids and energy, it changes throughout gestation. It's dynamic. So for instance, in the beginning or the early stages of gestation, this ratio could be around 2.36. and at the end of gestation, 3.1. So this means that at a certain moment, energy is more important than lysine. And the other stage, or at a certain or another moment, lysine will be more important than energy. So, but what is the importance of knowing this information? It's the fact that on a day-to-day basis, on a practical day-to-day basis, we tend to work with one unique feed to attend all the sows, or to attend the requirements of all the sows in our barn. So first, second, third, fourth, sixth parity sows. We work with the same ratio well, the same ratio throughout the gestation. So neglecting that we have this dynamic change between amino acids and energy. So at the end of the day, we're forcing these animals to try to compensate at specific moments of gestation when this animal has less or when this animal has a higher nutrient intake. But of course, we know that this is not efficient. This has a negative impact on the animal's metabolism. This has a negative impact on the animal's performance. So forcing these animals to try to cope with these variations on its own, it has its implications. And this is what we'll see here. The same happens during lactation. Lactation is even a much more dynamic phase for the animals, especially because it's a short period. If we look at gestation, the gestation duration goes around 115 days, okay? But lactation, we're talking about 21, 24, or even 28 days. So the past 2 years, our team has been investigating and understanding the dynamics of body weight change during lactation and integrating this to precision feeding concepts. So we've been trying to figure out and understand how does the animal integrate its metabolism, its catabolism during lactation with its feeding behavior, with its feeding pattern. So for that, we installed in our facilities, we have these weighing scales where we weigh the sows every 40 seconds and the piglets also in the farrowing pen integrated to feeding stations. So what we're trying to understand here is how does this kinetics of feed intake link with the dynamics of body weight change in the sows. So for now, what we've seen in the first findings of our research is that there's a critical moment towards the dynamics of live weight change in the sows during lactation, which is between day 14 and day 20. This is the critical period. This is where the sow really loses body condition. And this matches with the moment where the litters also show an exponential growth rate. So from day 14 to 20. So what we see here is that there is a specific moment where the sows need much more nutrients to sustain the litter boom in terms of growth rate. But the problem is that this animal will be limited most of the times by its feed intake capacity. So this means that we have to try to work with a different ratio between protein and energy at this specific moment, because the sow is not only producing milk, but the sow also needs nutrients for its basal metabolism, for its maintenance. And this is also dynamic throughout lactation. So for instance, if we compare the requirements of lysine during the first week of lactation, and we compare the requirements of lysine at this specific moment where the animal has a much higher demand for sustaining litter development, there's a variation between 30 grams and 65 grams of lysine. So this makes a big difference in terms of how we're going to feed these animals. And very similar to what we do with gestation, we feed a unique diet, a unique ratio, and then we ask the sow to try via her kinetics deal with the situation. And this is very important because when we look at the kinetics of feed intake of sows, for example, you will see that independent if it's summer or winter, of course, we know that in winter, the sows, they have a much pronounced feed intake in relation to winter due to the limiting effects of heat stress. But on average, 80% of total feed intake of the sows occur during the night, between midnight and 9 o'clock in the morning. So if we have a management system that does not feed these animals properly or does not allow the sow to eat at these specific moments where she has a natural opportunity for this, this means that I will be limiting nutrient ingestion, and therefore the sow will have to use its own body reserves to compensate. And of course, it's not enough to sustain this high increase in milk capacity in attaining the litter demand at that specific moment. So as a consequence, this negative energy balance will impact on follicular development and oocyte quality, and this will lead to second litter syndrome. This will lead to losses in the subsequent phases, and of course this will compromise the cell's longevity within our system. We must also understand that current cells are under constant metabolic changes and challenges, and one of them is oxidative stress. Several studies have indicated that gestating cells and lactating cells are under systemic oxidative stress throughout gestation and throughout lactation. This due to the fact that these animals are high producing animals. So we have a much more intensive fetal development. We have a much more muscle development in these animals. And also during lactation, you have a catabolical process, especially between day 14 and day 20. So these animals naturally are being challenged by their production capacity. And when we look at the impacts of this oxidative stress, so when we have an increased oxidative stress, the availability of natural antioxidants will also reduce during gestation and lactation. So this means that we have to protect these animals. And if we don't protect these animals, this is what happens. This, for example, these are results from studies that we've been conducting here in Brazil at the university with commercial farms. In the past 2 years, we've been studying plasma indicators in commercial farms in Brazil. And what we've identified on these farms is that basically 100% of the sows, they suffer from metabolic disorders. So for instance, we've got sows that, well, for instance, in the sows in the commercial farms that we evaluated, almost 100% of the sows showed low alkaline phosphatase, which could be related to iron, magnesium, zinc, or even B12 deficiencies. We've also observed in our studies that 100% of the sows indicated or showed high aspartate aminotransferase enzyme levels, which is an indicator of liver cell injuries. So what we've seen here is that these animals are being forced to a limit, and this limit is causing damages to their essential organs. This could be one of the reasons why we have been facing high cell mortality in the past 6 years. This is another study that we conducted here in Brazil with different farms with the same genetics, but different farms, different feeding programs, where we looked at the levels of vitamin D, calcium, and phosphorus. And what we saw on these farms, or in between farms, was we observed variations of up to 10 times in terms of vitamin D, calcium, phosphorus. And what we also saw is that these levels of vitamin D, calcium, phosphorus are directly related to performance and longevity. And our results or our findings indicated that the farms that have the lowest levels of calcium, phosphorus, and vitamin D were the sows that showed the worst performance traits, and were the sows or the farms that had the lowest longevity rates in the production systems. So it's clear to us that these animals have changed. These animals have a high production capacity, but on the other hand, these animals, from a metabolic point of view, they also are suffering with this high productivity. And one of the main problems is that we continuously, or we're still feeding these animals the way we used to feed them 10, 20 years ago. We haven't changed the way we look at these sows from a nutritional point of view, and how we look at them, especially from a feed management point of view. We're still feeding these animals the same way we used to feed them, like I said, 10 years ago, for example. And this is a huge impact, because based on the way you feed these animals, this will impact on the efficiency of how these animals will use the nutrients, or at least the feed that you're giving to these animals. This has to do directly with feeding behavior. I always like to say that feeding behavior is completely different than feeding management. The way the animal wants to eat is not necessarily the way you are feeding the animal, and this will impact on the animal's metabolism. And if we throw into this equation the impact of environmental factors, or environmental challenges, so for example, heat stress, we know that the environment, or at least heat stress, is the first limiting factor for efficient pig production. And what we see here is that heat stress intensifies oxidative damage in these animals. So if you have an animal that naturally is under systemic oxidative stress, and then you challenge this animal with heat stress, this will intensify even more these damages caused by this negative balance in its metabolism and also associated to environment. The same goes with mycotoxins. Recently, we finished a big study looking at the impacts of mycotoxins on cell mortality and abortions. And what we've seen is that when the animals are challenged with mycotoxins from day 75 to 115, what we saw is that when you don't have mycotoxin presence, no mortality. But when you have mycotoxin impacting on these animals, cell mortality was around 16% from day 75 to 115. And when you add a deactivator, a mycotoxin deactivator, to protect this animal, we were capable of reducing cell mortality. And then when we looked at the impact of these mycotoxins from day one, post-farrowing until weaning, we saw that control, you have a natural mortality, which is around 5%, which is expected due to secondary factors. But when we look at the effect of mycotoxins, 31% cell mortality during lactation. And when we use the deactivator associated to mycotoxins, this reduced to 11%. So it shows that these animals are naturally challenged. So the internal organs, mainly the liver, is already being hammered by the natural metabolical challenges and processes. And then if we throw on heat stress, if we throw on a mycotoxin challenges, this will intensify, and the animals are not capable of dealing with this. And as a result, we get mortalities, abortions, and of course, this will compromise the animal's longevity. And one last thing that we saw from our study, and this is very important, is piglets, they share the same redox status and oxidative stress pattern of the cell. So what happens to the cell happens to the piglet. What we saw from our studies that natural antioxidant factors in piglets followed the same pattern of the cell. This is mainly because mycotoxins are transferred via milk, and also the natural antioxidant components also transferred via milk to the piglet. So meaning that if we challenge the cells, we challenge the piglets. So not only will you affect or will you impact on the cell's survival, on the cell's longevity, but you also impact on the outcome of the progeny during lactation and also later stages. So as concluding remarks, it's highly relevant and important that we understand that our cells have changed. So from a production point of view, these animals produce more, but also from a body weight perspective, these animals are much more leaner. These animals demand much more to sustain the whole structure. Understanding the dynamics of these requirements and metabolism changes is essential. We have to understand all the metabolic phenomena that occur throughout gestation and lactation, so that then we can apply proper feeding strategies at these specific moments, protect these animals against challenging metabolic disorders or even external challenging factors, which means that applying precision strategies is the key for feeding properly these high producing cells. Understanding that you have this dynamic change in requirements at specific moments means that we have to invest in precision feeding strategies. We can no longer go on feeding these animals how we have been feeding them the past 20 years. And in this sense, the use of functional nutrients and functional feed additives play an important role to protect and improve the cell performance and longevity under our challenging commercial situations. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and it will be a pleasure to answer your questions. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Bruno. That was a really interesting presentation, and I know some of you out there have questions, so please go ahead and put those questions in the questions box so we can get them answered at the end of our session. So next, I'd like to introduce Bettina Biela-Wörtel, who received her doctorate in veterinary medicine from the University of Veterinary Medicine in Vienna, and she was a practicing veterinarian before joining the University Clinic for Swine at the University of Vienna. Since 2020, she has been a mycotoxin project manager right here at DSM Animal Nutrition and Health. Please, Bettina, jump right in.
The protection of gilts and sows against the harmful impact of mycotoxins is a prerequisite for longevity of sows and high piglet quality. Professor Silva highlighted how challenging it is to meet the requirements of our highly productive sows and to keep them healthy. But what is the consequence if we do not pass this challenge? Raising a sow is an investment which is typically paid back only after a sow produced 3 litters. Older sows perform better than young ones. So in case of a very young herd, there are less piglets than in a herd with a more balanced age structure. Also, if there's a constant introduction of young gilts into the herd, the risk of disease introduction increases, and it will be difficult to reach an even herd immunity. We lose sows for production for different reasons. The worst cases are, of course, sudden death or euthanasia. In farms in the United States, sows' mortality ranges between 5 to 35%, and there's a clear upward trend. So how do mycotoxins fit in the picture? Mycotoxins can cause clinical symptoms and in extreme cases also death. For example, fumonisins can cause left heart failure, which results in porcine pulmonary edema and death. Zearalenone is known for the negative impact on fertility. Visible symptoms are, for example, enlargement of the vulva or, in case of male pigs, feminization. Deoxynivalenol, which belongs to the group of trichotillosins, can cause feed refusal and vomitus. These visible symptoms are just the tip of the iceberg. In modern production, we face much more frequently unspecific subclinical effects. For example, some mycotoxins, including deoxynivalenol, can modulate the gut microbiome and cause leaky gut syndrome. Mycotoxins also have an immune modulating effect and may lead to vaccination failure. Mycotoxins impair liver and kidney as well as fertility. You can imagine that it's often difficult to link these unspecific problems with mycotoxins. To assess the risk, diagnostics need to be applied. Together with our partners, DSM provides highly sophisticated diagnostic methods, and DSM representatives can support you with the interpretation of results. The DSM World Mycotoxin Survey confirms that mycotoxins are definitely a risk and a constant risk. So far in 2022, we collected data from about 400 finished feed samples intended for swine. Here, the 6 major mycotoxins, aflatoxins, sen, don, T2, fumonisins, and ochratoxins are displayed. 3 of the major mycotoxins can be found in more than 70% of the samples, and 82% of samples were contaminated with at least 2 of these major mycotoxins. But not only the major well-known mycotoxins matter. In the first quarter of the year, more than 100 feed samples were analyzed with the most comprehensive method available, Spectrum 380, which covers more than 1,000 substances, including emerging mycotoxins and masked mycotoxins. In average, respective samples contained 42 mycotoxins and metabolites, and all samples contained more than 10 mycotoxins. So to sum it up, a high proportion of feed samples is contaminated with multiple mycotoxins. Let us go now deeper into some aspects. A sow which delivers and raises more than 30 piglets a year, of course, needs to take in and digest feed very efficiently. Mycotoxins can compromise this by reducing feed intake, by causing a shift to negative bacteria in the intestine, by reducing villous height, and by destroying the gut barrier. Also, the liver is a major target of many mycotoxins. In this first study, pregnant sows were exposed to a diet contaminated with cerealenone and deoxynivalenol. This contamination resulted in a reduction of feed intake in gestation and subsequently in a reduced average piglet weight in the toxin group compared to the control. But not only feed intake, but also digestion and resorption can be impacted by mycotoxins. In another study conducted in pregnant sows, cerealenone significantly decreased the number of beneficial bacteria in the cecum. Furthermore, villous height and therefore the resorptive surface in the jejunum was significantly reduced compared to the control. The results also showed that cerealenone caused oxidative stress and triggered pro-inflammatory response in the intestine. Mycotoxins also impact tight junctions. These are structures which are connecting intestinal epithelial cells with each other and build the gut barrier. If these structures are loosened, different luminal antigens can translocate uncontrolled from the gut lumen into the body. This is also known as leaky gut. This is, for example, true for commensal bacteria, for pathogens, for food antigens, but of course also for mycotoxins and other toxins like endotoxins. In the study displayed, the expression of different tight junction proteins was measured in piglets exposed to either deoxynivalenol, cerealenone, or a combination. The expression of the important tight junction proteins, claudin 4 and E-carterin, was reduced in all toxin groups, proving the negative impact of the respective toxins on the intestine barrier. Mycotoxins also harm the liver. The liver has many important functions, including detoxification. I once read even in a textbook that the liver is the most altruistic organ in the body. And of course, damage of the liver affects the whole organism. Different mycotoxins are known to impact liver health and functionality. In a study conducted in 2020 in pregnant gilts, histopathological changes due to deoxynivalenol and cerealenone, both alone and in combination, have been assessed. Especially in the combined group, major pathological changes could be found. For example, you see in the pictures that there was an increased number of leukocytes indicating inflammation, as well as an increased number of apoptotic cells. So to sum it up, mycotoxins are targeting the gastrointestinal tract and the liver, affecting functionality and integrity. This leads to dysfunction of organs and tissues, and in worst case, to mortality and involuntary culling. Reproductive problems are another major reason for involuntary culling and can be directly or indirectly caused by mycotoxins. I want to present you an in vitro trial showing the detrimental effects of mycotoxins on early embryogenesis, followed by findings of a field trial. So, after fertilization, the fertilized oocyte undergoes several steps of cell division, a process called cleavage. By implantation time, the oocyte has developed to a so-called blastocyte. At least 5 blastocytes have to be successfully implanted, we are calling them then embryos, to maintain the pregnancy. If this cleavage process is disrupted anyhow, there will be small litters, or in case of less than 5 implanted embryos, gestation will be terminated and the sow will return to heat. In an in vitro trial, significantly less fertilized oocytes underwent cleavage and developed blastocytes when exposed to either cerealenone, deoxynivalenol, or to the two mycotoxins in combination. This is only one mechanism how mycotoxins can harm reproductive performance and therefore longevity. As a contrast to this basic research, I now want to present you a trial conducted by Biomine, now part of DSM, in cooperation with the University of Berlin under practical conditions. A group of sows was exposed to 2,500 ppb deoxynivalenol and 200 ppb zearalenone for 3 consecutive production trials. The most pronounced effects on piglets were an increase of underweight piglets, reddening and enlargement of the vulva, necrosis, and splay-legged animals. The impact on the piglets led to enhanced pre-weaning mortality, a reduced weaning weight, and less weaned piglets per sow. In sows, the wean to estrus interval was prolonged. The feed intake in lactation was reduced, as well as the farrowing rate. Also in sows, signs of hyperestrogenism were visible and prolapses occurred. You now already heard much about the negative impact of mycotoxins today, and you will even hear more. But what is the solution? Often, when people are talking about mycotoxin detoxification products, they use the term binder. They are referring to only one mechanism of detoxification, the absorption of mycotoxins. Every product within DSM's Mycofix product line contains a blend of minerals which meets the requirement of the European Union Reference Laboratory and therefore is registered in the European Union. That means it binds more than 90% of aflatoxin B1 under defined conditions. Anyway, absorption only works for some mycotoxins, independent of chemical characteristics. Aflatoxins as well as ergot alkaloids and also to a certain extent ochratoxins can be bound. For fumonisins, deoxynivalenol and zearalenone and others, we need another approach, and the strategy of binding alone will not be very successful. So, to detoxify trichotillins, fumonisins and zearalenone, Biomine, which is now part of DSM, developed a microorganism and 2 purified enzymes which specifically and irreversibly biotransform these toxins into non-toxic metabolites. So far, more than 800 mycotoxins have been identified. Not all of them can be targeted by the strategies absorption and biotransformation. So to support the animals against the negative effects of different mycotoxins on liver, immune system and gut integrity, a blend of natural ingredients containing licorice, algae and milk thistle extract is used in the Mycofix product line. Let us now come to an end and sum up. Mycotoxins frequently occur in feedstuff and pose a constant risk for the animals. They negatively impact health and productivity of pigs by different mechanisms. The effects are often quite unspecific, therefore feed need to be analyzed for mycotoxins content. It is highly recommendable to establish a mycotoxin risk management. This means not only, but especially, sows and gilts need to be protected from the negative impact of mycotoxins by risk assessment and preventive use of a high-quality detoxification product to ensure longevity and productivity. We at DSM are your partners in mycotoxin risk management. We care about the potential and welfare of your sows and their piglets.
Thanks so much for that, Bettina. I've been seeing some great questions coming through in the question mark box, so a reminder to please get those questions in there. I'm looking forward to a really interesting Q&A. So to close things out today is Hans Bungard. He received his doctorate in veterinary medicine from the Royal Veterinary Agriculture College in Copenhagen and is the founder and owner of Porcus, a swine consultancy with more than 20 vets that work exclusively with pigs at more than 1,200 farms around the world. He's a specialist in the prolific sow and how to maximize productivity. Thanks for being here today, Hans.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. today we'll have to speak about the practical experience of mycotoxins on sow farms, and my name is Hans Budgaard. The performance in the best of our farm is actually more than 40 PSY, and it's very, very high performing sows and farms. And this really have a high demand for these sows and farms that they are keeping up with all the thing they are fighting for, and especially that it's important that they can keep up the high performance all the time. And as we can see in this slide, you are actually at not so good development in the sow mortality. There was in the last quarter was 11%, and in the first quarter was 16, and this is for sure not acceptable, and this is also for the animal welfare regulation in Denmark, that we must have less than 14% of sows every year. So in this case, we really need to focus on our sows' longevity to minimize the mortality. So despite this really high performing sow farm, it's still have fighting some problems, and especially the high mortality in actually in this case. So what is, turning back to your subject, is that the toxins really influence a lot in many of our farms, especially when they are high performing, and they are quite more sensible in our prolific lines than they were previous. In my career, I began, and we were happy about 20 piglets per sow per year, and now again I just told you they are more than 40. So in this development has been huge and fantastic in many ways, but also the negative on this is that they are much more sensible to many diseases and toxins and feed problems as well, and also the management of the people that are working with the farms really need to keep up in many ways. But the toxins that we normally see is fusarium related, DON, cerealalone, T2, and will be seen before harvest. And as you can see the pictures here, sometimes the harvest has not been perfectly because we have a rainy season also during the summertime. After harvest, also the storage and the silo management need to be in a very good way to minimize the development of toxins, and we see very often Mycotoxin problems and also other fusarium toxins, especially when the water level is too high in the grain. The efficacy of the mycotoxins for sure in swine are very huge variation between the different things, just from gut and intestinal health problems to abortions and enlarged uterus, rectal prolapse is some of the things, but for sure what we very often will see is that it's very difficult to point out exactly what's going on. But what we feel in our experience is that many of these mycotoxins is underdiagnosed, they are misinterpreted, and perhaps also not fully understood what's going on, and both for the veterinarians, but for sure also for the farmers and the stock people and in the farms are these symptoms can very difficult to assess and to point out what is going on. So for us, it's really about knowing the farm's normally procedures and performance and what's going on, and what is when we change something, and then they very often go back. They change for a new recipe, or they change for a new kind of grain. And in this case, we see some of the problems coming up. Some effects of the mycotoxin can see during the necropsy, and as a veterinarian working in the field, we do a lot of necropsy. It's one of our favorite tools to find out what's going on. And for sure, in this case, we can see cyst in the ovary, more or less related to zearalenone. Also, sudden bleeding in intestine and sudden dying of sows can very often happen. Fetal changes, we sometimes also very see, and especially abortions or related to returns in the problematic in the reproductive cycle. Liver and bladder for sure also influence a lot of the toxins as well, and very often we see they're pale and not and enlarged and not feeling what they normally should performing. Just to go back to some of the cases that we have seen, is one farm here with 1,500 sows that had clinical signs of returns, abortions up to 5% of abortions, and normally we are less than 1% of abortions. Increased mortality also in the sow farm, and this is for sure costing a lot of money, but also for disturbance and for the quality of the production of the farm. In this case, we analyzed for some of the dead sows. We took some bile out of the gallbladder, and we found DON quite high, more than 200 and 172 nanogram, and also zearalenone is also a little bit enlarged. And in this case, this combination was one of the reasons why. And after we put in mycotoxin deactivator and management in the feed, the problem disappeared. So in this case, it's about reproductive problems that were occurring in this farm, and this is very often the case in many of our farms. From the case number 2 was 900 sows, and they had a lot of prolapses. 1% of all the sows had actually a prolapse of rectal, and also had a poor appetite. And despite of a lot of antibiotic treatment, there was no efficacy. And the same as the previous one, we analyzed some bile and from the gallbladder, and saw that the DON was more or less normal, but zearalenone was enlarged, and in this case, we had the solution for us was to put in mycotoxin deactivator in the feed and also improve and to clean the cleaning of the silo, and to take away some of the part of the grain that was not looking good, and then the situation developed very well, and then was back to normal afterwards. So the importance of the feed hygiene for sure is so important, and in this case it's very hidden, and you cannot always see that you have a problem. But in this farm, there was some pipes with feed which had built up inside the feeding system, and all the time dropping up some of the very bad feed, and in this case we had the problems with poor appetite and also prolapses in the farm. This is also the same for a wet feeding system. We need to have a cleaning and proper management in this system to really minimize the problems from the toxin problems. For me, as a veterinarian, we must say that that water is more or less the same as a medicine, and like I very often tell my customers is that water is the cheapest medicine you can use, and also if you have toxin in the feed, despite putting in toxin binders, you can ensure that it's very important that you had enough free access for the sows to drink enough water so they can flush out for the kidney some of the toxins this way. Otherwise, the symptoms will be even worse. Non-feed sources of mycotoxin is for sure that what we have seen in especially in straw, and many of our farms says that straw is looking very good and it's not a problem at all. But actually we very often find it in when we send in straw to investigate for the toxins, and also straw is for animal welfare. Very well, so they have free access to straw, and this is mandatory for sows in Denmark to have access to straw. In this case, we had one of my customers had a check for the straw, and he was very bold and said straw was very good and his harvest was fantastic and there shouldn't be any problem at all. But in this case, we actually found quite a high level of DON and also T2, and in this case he took away the straw and improved her reproduction. So in this case, it's the straw is looking very innocent, but can be a potential threat for your farm as well. Also, in other farms, we very often see that they can be constipated, especially around farrowing. And in this case, we know that this will increase the farrowing or parturition duration. And if this is the case, especially because of perhaps the peristaltic of the gut intestinal health is not as good, then in this case we know that the stillborn level will be much higher. And this is also, from my perspective, it's a sign of mycotoxin problem. Also, for sure, in our farms, it's very dependent on high milk yield, very high lactation curve for the sows. And when you're investigating sows and trying to examine them, it's very difficult to assess how the milk yield is. But I believe that mycotoxin is one of the major threats. Is for sure that our milk yield is lowered, and that many of our sows are not milking as good as we expect, and they will have acalactia too early or a little bit subclinical mastitis more or less all the time. So So in this case, it's really about adding in this toxin deactivators just to minimize the problems of milk, the milk yield. Yes. The daily work for our farms is for sure to really take care of especially the VIP treatment for the sows just around farrowing, and the stock people are doing a very great job if they need to have an excellent performance. In this case, if you don't have a co-player, if the sows are not feeling well or having a poor appetite or just not performing as we expect, then it's really problematic. So in our case, it's one of the reasons why we put in toxin binders or deactivators to ensure that our sows just around farrowing really at the top level, because if they're not there, the pre-wean mortality or scouring of the piglets will be too high. So a lot of routines and management things the stock people will have to work with every day, but we need to help them to keep them as good as possible if the feed is low in mycotoxins. Our typical kind of diet in the lactation diet is 40% barley, 40% wheat, and then the rest for the soya. And in this case, we only have a few ingredients. And if as we had some years ago, we had a big problem with the wheat, with high level of DON, then for sure that influenced a lot of things, because in the diet they are perhaps 30 to 60% of the diet is based on wheat. So they can really suffer from this kind of toxin-related disorders, so to say. So end of my day is mycotoxin really can cause many problems. It can be really complicated to investigate and probably misunderstood for many of our farmers and also for us as veterinarians. In our practice, we for sure recommend that the implementation of the mycotoxin is necessary to support the longevity of the sows and also to keep up the performance and the piglet quality. Just keep away diseases. So in our opinion, this is necessary to add in toxin deactivator to have a very good performance. Very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much for that, and let's go straight to some of those questions. And the first one I have is for Bruno. What was the level of mycotoxin contamination in the sow trial in Brazil?
Okay. Well, we tested several mycotoxins together, because the fact is that most studies normally focus on one unique mycotoxin, and what we know is that there is a synergetic effect between mycotoxins. So the idea was to actually try to mimic what happens on the field level when you have several mycotoxins acting together. What we did was we tested levels that are around 15 to 20% higher than what is expected. So not a very high contamination level, but let's say an average, a moderated contaminated contamination level, which was enough to show to us that this will impact negatively on the animal's performance and also on sow mortality, meaning that it's highly relevant that we do protect these animals.
Great, thank you. I have another question here for Bettina. What will be the future of mycotoxin management on sows related to the use of alternative raw materials? So how are alternative raw materials affecting mycotoxin management?
Yeah, hello. I think it's definitely a topic, especially now with the rise in feed prices. Farmers are looking for alternatives, and it's of course possible that they use materials which they would normally not use. And this is in a sense of sustainability. It really makes sense also for the future, so that we can use the high quality components for human nutrition, and for animal nutrition more go to the byproducts. But of course, this can be a risk of mycotoxin contamination. This is, for example, true for DDGS, which is a quite valuable component or feed component, but can be enormously contaminated. For example, sugar beets, depending on the year, are very often contaminated with quite high levels of cerealenone. So it's definitely important to check the risk before using such materials. These materials really have to be part of the mycotoxin risk management. And yes, what we are currently doing is also to have to integrate more of these byproducts into our survey, so that we have a better idea of the real contamination, the real risk. I hope this was satisfying.
Great.
Bruno,
Perfect.
do you have
Thank
something
you, let me go to a question we have here for Hans on the price of mycotoxins. Is the price of mycotoxin deactivators, is the price a limitation for the use in Denmark?
Yes, for sure. The prices are important for everything, especially right now, because the really high grain prices are very high. So this is problematic in many ways, but still the most important is to keep up the performance, as we have also discussed today, is to keep up the best performance, because otherwise it costs much more than this if you take it out, because many for sure would like to save some money, but in my opinion it's still worth it in many ways, and also again just to keep up the very high performance in the farms.
Great. I see we've already run a couple of minutes over. So if we haven't answered your question already, we'll send you an answer via email. And thanks for those of you who've hung in there with us for the last couple of minutes. And thank you to our speakers for being here and sharing your information. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.